Okay. Do I need to give an introduction, or I just go straight into it? Anyway, I will just talk, and whatever needs to be cut, you can cut later, of course. So, shall I begin then? Well, greetings, everybody, and thank you for the opportunity to talk about what I think is probably one of the most, if not the most critical issue of our time, and that is that of sustainability. And in talking about ecosystems and why and how they're deteriorating, I think that the answer to the why is fairly simple. They're deteriorating because essentially we are destroying them. And when we talk about ecosystems, I think one of the things that we need to take into account is that everything is connected to everything else. The plants, the animals, other living organisms, all live together in a very carefully balanced state with their surroundings, the air, the water, the soil, and so on. And so if we just change one small part of the ecosystems, we can throw everything else very quickly out of balance. And I just wanted to raise that point because it's where this whole idea of what we call tipping points or thresholds becomes so crucial. Because we can really make very small, gradual changes, say, to the world's climate over a period of time. But we may reach a threshold where suddenly some small additional disturbance causes a massive disruption throughout the whole system. And so that's in a way, I think, what we are beginning to see some of the first signs of now, whether it's through the melting of the glaciers, the warming of the oceans, the melting of the sea ice, and so on, and with all its ramifications, which we are seeing right now, with all the extreme weather events, whether they be floods or hurricanes, droughts, heat waves, and of course, all of those have very significant implications also for human health. So, I think one ecosystem which illustrates that point where we could be close to reaching some sort of a tipping point is the Amazon rainforest. And as we all know, we're cutting that down at a very fast pace. I think we've already cut down at least around 20% of the Amazon rainforest. And that is one of the most biodiverse ecosystems. It's home to a huge number of animal and plant species, and many of them still actually have to be discovered to make way for, and so on. So that not only contributes to species loss, but it also releases very large amounts of carbon dioxide to the atmosphere, and also to the loss of a very important carbon sink, because as we know, trees absorb and they sequester a large amount of carbon dioxide. So that is, a significant contribution, man-made contribution, deforestation to global warming. And of course, deforestation also brings us into much closer contact with wildlife. And that too obviously has all sorts of implications in the spread of disease. And then, of course, not to mention that just cutting down trees can lead to soil erosion, flooding, and so on. And so in so many different ways, deforestation impacts ecosystems in a very significant way. So, and then I thought maybe to give another example also of a very biodiverse ecosystem, one that is also affected by human activities, but also significantly by climate change, and that is coral reefs. And here again, we've destroyed maybe 20%, if not more, of our existing coral reefs. And a very large part, maybe as much as a third of what remains could in fact collapse over the next 2 decades if we don't, take action. And the reason for that is the warming of the ocean caused by increased greenhouse gas emissions, and also the increased acidity of the oceans, which causes together the bleaching and the die-off of these corals. And that we also have to couple with, for example, increases in pollution, fertilizer runoff, pesticides, toxic chemicals, and so on. And so in many variety of ways we are impacting our coral reefs. And I think that, on this whole question of biodiversity, both land degradation and the loss of habitat is a very big driver, and that coupled with climate change. Those two are probably, amongst the biggest drivers of the loss of biodiversity. And so just to say, one of the reasons biodiversity is so important is that it does provide a type of insurance policy. So, for example, if one species dies out, maybe it can't adapt to climate change or to increases in temperature, maybe another one can take its place. And so we have been seeing a very, very rapid disappearance of species from planet Earth. And, there are many scientists who seriously believe that we may, in fact, have entered what's called the sixth extinction, with the fifth one having happened when the dinosaurs went extinct. So the point being that we're losing species at a very fast rate and at a much, much faster rate than happened before we came onto the scene. And of course, extinction is irreversible. Once a species is gone, it's gone forever. And especially when we think of how much of our pharmaceuticals, our medicines, and so on are based on plants, animals, microbes, and so on, we realize, how important that is. And one example of a very interesting animal in that respect is the polar bear, which, as you probably know, is threatened by what's happening in the Arctic. But it's very interesting from the point of view in that it goes into hibernation for about 7 months, but it doesn't actually lose bone mass. It doesn't develop, for example, osteoporosis. And also, they become very obese, not moving around over such a long period of time, but they also don't develop, for example, diabetes. They don't urinate during that time. They don't develop kidney disease. From a point of view like that, just one example is, of course, of great value to us, just from that one perspective. So those are just two examples of natural ecosystems and the way in which we are impacting them. But I just also want to mention two urban ecosystems, because urban ecosystems are, of course, very key to us, especially given, for the first time, people are now more people, in fact, are living in urban areas than they are in rural areas. And so if we look at, say, the problem of urban air pollution, it's estimated probably 3 million, if not more, people die each year from various diseases which are linked to urban air pollution. Stroke, heart disease, coronary obstructive lung disease, lung cancer, respiratory infections, and so on. So it's got, quite a high, it contributes quite a high percentage of the global burden of mortality, actually. Most of those deaths come from countries like China and India, I guess, which is no surprise given the terrible air pollution problems that they are experiencing. But not only do those countries have problems of urban air pollution, they also have big problems related to indoor air pollution, as do many countries throughout Africa, So I thought that I wanted to mention that issue, because we generally tend to think of, one type of energy crisis, but we've got another type of energy crisis in many developing countries throughout the world, throughout those countries certainly, and the continent of Africa, and that's due to the reliance on biomass burning, from wood burning, from coal, from dung, from crop, and so on, crop residues, in a very inefficient stoves. And it's probably somewhere around 3 billion people now actually rely on this biomass burning for cooking and for heating. And that, in fact, accounts for even more deaths than from outdoor air pollution. I think that it's over 4 million people actually die. Mainly women and children are affected, because they're the ones who are doing the cooking and so on. So just to say that we have made a lot of progress in reducing urban air pollution, obviously, especially in developed countries. Middle income countries, countries in transition, still have a way to go, and we still got a way to go in terms of addressing this other energy problem related to biomass burning. Although even on that, I think we have made, especially in recent years, quite a lot of improvement in terms of increasing access to electrification. But often, that's also a cost factor as well. So the other problem to mention is that related to water pollution. And just to give one example of the runoff from agricultural runoff, for example, from nitrogen and phosphorus in fertilizers into watercourses, which causes what are known as algal blooms. And, they deplete the water of oxygen when they die, and they decompose, and they cause these dead zones. And, increasingly large parts of the ocean are now actually depleted of oxygen, which are growing in size and in number. And that's also coupled with global warming, because as the oceans and water warms, it holds less oxygen. And then we have to couple those sorts of problems with other problems like overfishing and so on. And of course, all the waste, the plastics, the toxic chemicals that we are dumping into the ocean, and of course, which also make their way into the food chain and eventually also impact on human health. So just another example of a major problem that we face. And then the other one I thought important to mention is, of course, the whole problem of the looming problem of and you may know Cape Town, which is actually where I'm from originally, became the first world city to come very close to running out of water. They had the worst possible drought in 100-year history, and came very close to reaching what was called day zero, which essentially was when the pipes run dry. So that, I think, was probably a real wake-up call for many cities, throughout the world, especially with such a large percentage of the world's population that actually now live in water-stressed areas. Some estimates are about 40% of the global population live in water-stressed areas. And many, increasingly depleting their groundwater sources. And so, of course, many implications again for health when we think of the infectious and diarrheal diseases which are associated with inadequate water and sanitation. And again, it's a little bit like, on the energy front, we have already, a majority of the world's population who have been living in near, day zero conditions, with well over 1 billion people now lacking adequate and safe drinking water, many more lacking adequate sanitation facilities. A large percentage of the global population actually lack inadequate access, don't even have access, for example, to a toilet facility of any kind, and have to defecate out in the open. I think the estimates are something like around 20% of the global population. So that, of course, is a huge a problem we have to grapple with as well. So I think, um, if we have to, or if I have to suggest which are the most critical problems that we're facing, I would put them down as, well, obviously climate change, because climate change affects everything else. Biodiversity as well. And then I would say land use degradation, pollution, and water scarcity. Those would be, I mean, there's so many there of environmental problems that which we could mention, but I would think that those five stand out to me as being among the most critical: climate change, loss of biodiversity, land use degradation, pollution, and water scarcity. But again, I think the point I wanted to make is that they are all very much interrelated and interlinked. But it's really the magnitude, the scale, and the pace in which we are making all of these changes to the face of planet Earth that is unprecedented in human history. So what can we do about this? What role, firstly, can governments and communities play in affecting change? Well, and this is my personal view, that I think shared by many. One of the reasons for the mess that we're in today, I think, is a lack of cooperation between different government sectors. Whether we're talking about agriculture or energy or, housing, transport, health, and so on, don't, by and large, work very well together. And then I think similarly, we have a problem, of different tiers of government not working well together. And I think we did see that certainly here in the US with the pandemic. So, not really a very good coordination between, the national, the subnational level, the local level, and add to that the global level. So another big problem. And then also lack of, in a way, poor coordination with private sector, NGOs, communities, academia, research, and so on. So, in my view, I think what we desperately need is more of joined up, sort of coordinated decision making and partnerships at all levels. I think if we can achieve that, we'll go a long way to solving many of our problems. And I think, especially at the local level, at the community level, at the neighborhood level, we do have, in fact, many examples of very successful initiatives in that regard. One can think of initiatives like, sustainable cities, healthy cities, eco-cities. There's, a large number of cities for climate change, and more recently also resilient cities, and so on. So I think that's very, very encouraging, and I think a huge amount can be done at that level, irrespective in a way of what's being done at other levels. So I think it's important to note. And then, of course, the important role, very critical role that communities can play and are playing in organizing around climate change here and elsewhere around the world. Now, I think we can build on the Black Lives Matter movement, for example. We could build a lot of momentum from that. And, a good example is if we think back to the 1960s, we had the, in a way, the birth of the environmental movement. And, that gave rise to any number of very progressive environmental policies and regulations here in the States. It gave rise to the National Environmental Protection Act and the Clean Air Act and so on. So certainly governments can work with the private sector, and they can use a combination of regulatory measures and market mechanisms perhaps, And there are any number of things we can think of, tax incentives, subsidies to encourage green energy, for example, green infrastructure, green transport, and so on. Obviously, things like higher penalties on polluting industries, taxes on imports of products, perhaps from countries that have very high greenhouse gas emissions. And, I think a very important tool, in my view, is that of impact assessment. We don't really, I think, perhaps make enough use of that. But if we really did put that into practice, I think that, we could make sure then that projects and programs and policies, very importantly, which are likely to result in negative impacts on the environment, actually don't materialize. So I think that's an important tool in our toolbox. But overall, in general, governments, of course, can play a critical role in developing the type of policy frameworks, which encourage sustainability. And then not to mention, of course, governments are doing a lot on that, level all throughout the world. But we can also do a lot at an individual level to reduce our ecological footprint. And there was an interesting survey done in Italy, actually, where they asked people whether they thought, government action was needed, individual action, and so on. And I think most of them thought, government action was critical, but also, interestingly, that individual actions can also be very important. And so there are any number of those, one can think of, and that, I think increasingly people are doing, whether it's, recycling or, reusing, reducing their waste. Waste management was one of the key priorities identified actually in that survey, along with other aspects. Air pollution was one, and also climate change, I think. But, simple things like just walking and cycling and taking public transport. And hopefully, once we're over the pandemic, people will go back to taking public transport. But buying environmentally friendly products or going paperless, or retrofitting our houses with energy efficient technologies, farmers, going and moving towards more sustainable agriculture, regenerative agriculture, and so on. So I think that there is absolutely a huge amount that can be done on an individual level, and I think that if everybody were to do that, that could add up to make very, very significant changes. However, that said, we do need level. We need countries coordinating, and at the regional level. And I think, again, it's just interesting to see with the EU recovery plan that's aimed at measures to reduce greenhouse gases. I think that's very, very encouraging and very exciting that that's happening. And I think we've also seen that with the IMF, which is now linking loans for recovery to climate resilience policies. And I think there are now over more than 50 countries who have committed to addressing climate change in their coronavirus recovery plans. So again, that's another example, I think, of a very important initiative which can make a big difference. And then just to say a few words about the role of the United Nations, because I do think that is also very critical in galvanizing global action between countries. And so it's interesting now that sustainable development is in fact the overarching framework of the whole of the UN system. And that aims to integrate across the social, the environmental, and the economic dimension, which is really what we are concerned about when we're talking about sustainability and sustainable development, integrating across those dimensions. And the UN really has been working, we think, almost as sustainable development and this whole new initiative as being something relatively recently, but we have been working on that really for over 40 years, I would say, going back at least to the 1972 the UN conference on the human environment, which actually led to the birth of UNEP, the United Nations Environment Programme. But that was really the first global conference to focus on the global destruction of the environment. So we've known about these problems for years and years. And we've had the whole Rio process going on in the United Nations. I'm sure people remember the Earth Summit in 1992. And the follow-up, the 20-year follow-up in 2012, also held in Rio de Janeiro. We have had, for example, the MDG, the Millennium Development Goal process. That has played a critical role in pushing back on extreme poverty, communicable diseases, maternal and child health. We've seen great improvements in those. Not saying that's only due to the fact that we had the MDG process, but it certainly made a big difference to have a very concrete set. In that case, we had 8 goals with very a concrete set of goals and timelines and so on. And I think that we made a huge amount of progress. Now, a lot of that progress has unfortunately probably now been set back, but nevertheless. But what they tried to do in the UN was try to bring together these two strands, the environmental strand and the development strand together. And so in 2015, we had the launch of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, and which brings together all of this in sort of 17 goals, 169 targets, and many more indicators. Also, so the aim here is to try and integrate across the social, the environmental, the economic, so that these are not seen as separate issues. I think that's what's so critical about these goals now. It sets them apart from what's happened previously, I think, in that the attempt, anyway, is to integrate across these dimensions. And that's perhaps easier said than in theory than actually carried out in practice. But nevertheless, the question then becomes, so we've been going 5 years now, are we on track with the Sustainable Development Goals? And that's in many ways, I think, quite a difficult question to answer, because it is actually still fairly early days, a couple of years on, but we do find progress uneven, which is not surprising. It's a very, very ambitious agenda with aspirational goals, probably is the best way to describe these goals. But we've made progress. I think in terms of which have been, they've singled out 4 areas where progress is lacking. And again, not surprising, it's climate, it's biodiversity, waste management, and the other one on the social side it is rising inequalities. And I know in terms of the surveys that have been done in Italy, that those were all amongst top priorities in Italy, which is interesting. But now, of course, with the pandemic, and there was a report published this year, actually, in the UN, and sadly, it looks like we're going to see, rises in global poverty of the likes that we haven't seen probably since going back to 1998. That's, with millions of people being pushed back into extreme poverty. We may see increases again in maternal and child health, largely due to the disruption in health services. Increases in, we have, over 1 billion people living in slums. I talked about the problem of urbanization and so on, and the problems, environment and health problems in urban areas. But over 1 billion people live in slums. And so that's also likely to increase. But I do want to say, out of this terrible catastrophe that you and everyone else has gone through, that I think there are also, in a way, rays of hope and of opportunity that come out of that. And just as ecosystems in nature, the natural world, they can crash and then they can rebuild. And I think that we can do the same. And I think already we've seen, examples of decreases in air pollution. I think I don't know what the situation is right now, but certainly in China they saw dramatic reductions in air pollution levels. I think something like around 25%. We've seen, greenhouse gas emission levels dropping. Improvements in water quality. I think Venice was such a prime example of that. Um, and just in general, as we all know, fewer cars, less congestion, less pollution, less noise. Um, and so that's really, I think, given us, I think, some hope that we can actually change things around, and what a different new normal can look like. But on the other hand, if we go back to normal and fire up the economy and fund new coal-powered stations and increase our reliance on the oil and gas industry and continue with unsustainable consumption and production practices, then those gains are going to be very short-lived. So I think in many respects, a lot of people and scientists think we probably have one last chance to really affect change, and that might just be in the next year or two, to turn things around in a sort of like just once in a lifetime opportunity. Um, and I think just one small example of Milan, transferring its streets into pedestrian zones. It's just a wonderful example, I think, of the way things are changing, and hopefully this is going to happen throughout the world. Um, so, we don't want to be too alarmist, I don't think, because I think if we are, then people become very discouraged, then depressed, and they think there's nothing that they can do, and might as well enjoy whilst you can, exploit our remaining resources, and so on. So we have to be careful about that. But on the other hand, I think we also, don't want to give people a false sense of security. And I think we have to be honest with people. We have to find a way to restore people's faith in science. I think, a lot of people have, lost faith in a way in science, and so I think critical. And then I also do think, working across the political divide is absolutely essential. And we've seen here, for example, in the US, where debates on climate change have become very politically fraught, and in some ways so have the issues around the pandemic as well. So that's hugely unfortunate, and we have to absolutely work, I think, extremely hard to make sure that doesn't continue. I think many people, the so-called climate deniers, people deny climate change because they're actually scared. And they've done a lot of work on this here in this country. They sort of have categorized people into the 6 Americas, and how they feel about climate change. But a lot of them, I think, a lot of people are, understandably, they're scared about the solutions. How their livelihoods are going to be impacted, and how their way of life is going to change. Having to cut back significantly on greenhouse gas emissions if we're going to halve these by 2030. Think about that. We've got 10 years to halve our greenhouse gas emissions, and by 2050 to get to net zero. And I think an important part of that, maybe less so in Europe, than it is here in America. But it's just showing people that increasing consumption doesn't actually necessarily equate with increasing prosperity. So I think that's an important aspect, because clearly people will have to, change their consumption and production um, processes. And I think also maybe we need to just create a foundation, a new value system, a new respect for nature, and for people to understand that we are not actually separate from nature. We are part of nature. Um, and again, I think we can learn a lot from the pandemic. Just as we've seen, getting getting public health under control has been critical for getting the economy um, under control. Um, I think the same. We need to now, do the same with the environment. Show people how getting the environment under control is so fundamentally critical for the economy. And again, that's not that different from what we've been, trying to do now over many decades. Um, we think back to people, like the previous, Gro Harlem Brundtland, who actually first coined that term, sustainable development. Um, but looking at how, environment and economy could be reconciled. So it's very much what sustainability is about, creating that sort of resilience, um, finding ways to feed our growing global population without destroying our environment, encouraging regenerative agriculture and so on. Uh, I think all of this is absolutely possible. I would like to say I'm optimistic. I'm not optimistic when I look at the sustainability trends. I think that's absolutely clear. They are going, for the most part, in the wrong direction, notwithstanding the amount of work that is going on worldwide. I think that we can turn that around, though. I think we need the political will, and we've seen that definitely now in the United Nations and increasingly in many other countries, I think, working together. And we've definitely, I think, seen that in Europe and in other parts of the world. Um, so, we need to work together towards our common goals. But I do think, all that said, is that we really need to try, we need to generate a much greater sense of urgency. We don't want to be overly alarmist, as I said, but we do need, I think, to create this really great sense of urgency that literally there's not a single day to lose if we really are going to be able to save our planet. We only have one planet. But we really, I think, have perhaps, a year or two. So, the opportunities are closing in on us. But we can still turn things around. So that's, the point I thought I would just end off with. So I've covered a lot of
Absolutely.
things that, yeah, you can, yeah.
Thank you so much. That was fantastic. Really lots of information. Perhaps just for to have something that they can put as a summary, can I follow up on a few things and ask you to clarify? So one question is that you started off by saying there are changes that are only man-driven or caused by man that we need to worry about. But if the question I had, if you look at the planet deterioration, is that 100% caused by humans, or there is also some other non-human factors at play?
Well, yes, I would say the vast majority of problems, 90% plus are human caused. In terms of everything that we discussed with, pollution, toxic chemicals, deforestation, degradation of our land. We've degraded about 50%, if not more, of our, land resources as well. But in terms of climate change, yes, the vast, even that, of course, the vast majority is due either directly or indirectly to human activities, whether it's greenhouse gas emissions associated with fossil fuel burning, or with deforestation and agriculture, which are also important contributions. Yes, but so absolutely the overwhelming bulk of changes which are happening to our planet are as a result of human activities. Yeah.
Thank you. And the other question, I think it might be great. I think you gave us a list of 5 top priorities, your ranking. Perhaps it would be great if you can repeat that just for the camera, and also tell us how you rank them. Like, is that in terms of impact on human health, or rather economy, or the earth in general? I don't know whether there
You
is
know,
yeah. Go ahead.
yes, I wouldn't, yes, it's difficult to. So the 5, I think, key priorities are climate change, biodiversity, land use degradation, water scarcity, and pollution, and not necessarily in that order. But if I were to have to, rank them, I mean, that's tricky. But certainly, there's been a lot of work done on this whole concept. I talked about thresholds and tipping points, and there's been a lot of work done on this idea of planetary boundaries by the Stockholm Resilience Center, and this concept of living within a safe operating space. And so some of these boundaries are already beginning, to be surpassed. But the 2 factors which affect everything else are climate change and biodiversity. So from that point of view, they are so interconnected with everything else. They are critical. And then land use degradation and so on. Again, it's a very important contributor also, actually, to, as we discussed, to climate change, but also to loss of species and so on. And just in terms of our overall survival, if we completely degrade our land resources, etc., we're not going to be able to feed sustainably our growing population and so on. But that's also plays a role, of course, becoming much more, land resources are becoming much more critical with climate change, and water scarcity as well. Now, I mean, again, there, of course, climate plays a role. It plays a role with all of these, with increasing drought and so on. But there are also, mismanagement of resources and so on, especially when it comes to, I think, water use, etc. And we saw this actually very much also in the case of the Cape Town drought. So drought and climate change were important drivers, but there were many other issues which could have been better addressed with better foresight and planning, better management of resources, better, water conservation measures, etc. So, all these factors come into play. And then, of course, pollution comes into the picture with everything as well. Although, it's interesting because even with increasing particulate pollution, that can also slow down some of the warming trends. So that's a rather fascinating problem to look at. I mean, I mentioned how we've made good progress looking at, reductions in urban air pollution, many places throughout the world. But, in some people's views, that also could be accelerating climate change and, what's happening in the Arctic and so on. So, yeah, that's a fascinating issue because from a health point of view, it's almost one where from a health point of view, we have, beneficial impacts, but from a climate warming point of view, we may not.